Take a good look at me, will you please? Because I am the only thing standing between you and refreshments. So let's get to the chase, shall we? Quiet heroes will save the world, but they will never change it. That's the message I want to leave you today. Quiet heroes will save the world, but they will never change it. What does that mean? We love our heroes. We love them to have their 15 minutes of fame. We get a little uneasy, however, when they start to capitalize on that heroism. Case in point, we're so excited about our 3 American heroes in France who thwarted the terrorist attack on that train. We're delighted when they received the Legion of Honor Award in France from the French president. It was a little unsettling to me, at least on the next day, to find out that there was another hero that wasn't recognized right away. The first person to attack the gunman, to wrestle away the AK-47 and ended up getting shot in the back. We didn't hear a whole lot about him. But we did see the 3 American heroes mocking it up on the cover of People magazine. That's all right. We want them to have their fame. We want to hear their message. On the other hand, being on Dancing with the Stars, that's okay, I guess. You save a couple hundred people on a train, maybe you can save a reality TV show from extinction. That's what we're hoping. But it is a little bit unsettling. It's not what we might expect from our heroes. We want them to be quiet heroes. We want them to be humble and modest, even if they did save several hundred people. A couple years ago, I wrote a book about people who helped other people get through the latest economic recession. They tell me this has been happening to everybody all day. Please bear with me. I wrote the book about people who are helping other people get through the difficult times from mortgage foreclosures and job loss and things like that that happened during the Great Recession. And people didn't want to talk about themselves. They didn't want to be in the spotlight. I had to actually beg them to let me write about them in my book. They were okay if I finally told the story, if they didn't have to tell it themselves. When I would interview them personally, they were almost embarrassed to tell me their story. So what I ended up doing is writing them questions in emails and sending them a list of questions that they could answer in a written format, and they were much less embarrassed about doing it. They were quiet heroes. But they did change the world. And here's an example. At Clemson University, during the recession, with economic times as they were $38 million in the hole. They told everyone they were going to have to take a 1-week furlough, every employee in the university. And some of the professors and some of the top administrators went to the heads and said, hey, this is not fair. You can't do this. And they said, hey, we know you're upset, but everybody's got to do their part. And they said, no, it's not that we're upset about ourselves. We make good money. But what about the administrative clerks? What about the admissions counselors? What about the cafeteria workers? You take a week away from them, a salary, it could be devastating. Take 2 weeks from us instead. Well, the college wouldn't do that. So what the professors did is they raised $70,000 out of their own pockets. Not only did they give up a week's salary, but they gave their own money to reimburse the lowest paid workers at Clemson. And what they did in that process was not only save those people from a week's loss of salary, but they educated their own administration about fairness. Peter Samuelsson is a Hollywood producer. He produced, among other things, Revenge of the Nerds. I'm sure you've all seen that. Maybe not. But he lives in a Tony neighborhood outside of Hollywood called Holmby Hills. And he noticed that there were people living on his street, homeless people who had moved into the neighborhood and were living on the street. And one particular woman he saw was living in a refrigerator box. And the reason it caught his eye was because it was the same brand of refrigerator that he had in his home. So he stopped and he talked to her and he said, why don't you go to one of the many shelters in the area? And what he learned was that people on the street are afraid to go to the shelters. They're afraid of the people who work there because they might incarcerate them. They're afraid of the other homeless people because they might hurt them. So they're afraid to go to the shelters and they stay on the street. So he invented something called the EDAR. It stands for Everyone Deserves a Roof. It's kind of a combination shopping cart pop-up camper. And as you can see, it is not the end of homelessness. But what he did is he goes out and he gives this to the people on the street. And he says, here, sleep in this instead of the cardboard box or instead of sleeping on the grass. And then the homeless shelter counselors go to the people who have the EDAR and they say, hey, you know what? Instead of parking this on the street tonight, why don't you put it in our driveway at our shelter? And then they have them on the driveway, and then they can go out later in the night and say, why don't you come in and have a meal, have a shower, have a change of clothes? And slowly they can transition the people off the street and back into the shelters and eventually out of homelessness. Lisa Epstein is a nurse in Florida. She made a mistake when she got her mortgage for her house, and she signed a loan that had prepayment penalties and interest-only payments for the first 10 years. And she got into trouble, and the bank decided they were going to foreclose on her house. She couldn't afford an attorney, so she had to represent herself, and she went through all the paperwork, and what she found was that her house, her mortgage, had been sold several times from one bank to another to another. And as she looked through the paperwork, what she discovered is every piece of paper from every bank was signed by the same individual. And she realized that these predatory lenders, when they got into the foreclosure trouble, were doctoring up the paperwork so that they could get money collected on these houses. And not only did she save her own house from foreclosure, but she has educated the entire country about predatory lending and saved millions of people from foreclosure. Joe Works is a small business owner in Humboldt, Kansas. Population less than 2,000. He employs 10% of the population there. And during the economic recession, his business tanked, but he didn't want to lay anybody off. So rather than pay them to do their normal job, he paid them to do things like build a ball diamond for kids to play baseball, or put a new roof on the church, or fix up the parks and the sewer grates in the town. Anything he could think of that he could take money out of his own pocket to keep his 180 employees working. And Selena Roby, who was an abused wife, who lived in West Virginia, and her husband would beat her and oftentimes hold her captive for several days at a time. And one time he beat her to the point where he left her for dead on the bathroom floor. And only then was she able to grab her kids and escape. And when she went to the authorities and she reported them, they said, we would like to prosecute him, but there's no law in West Virginia against holding your spouse against their will. So she got a job working as a laborer on a construction site, and on her lunch hour, she would write this law for West Virginia. And she took it to the legislature, and she pushed it through, and she lobbied for it, and she got it passed, and now there's a law in West Virginia. By talking about their actions, by telling us what they do, heroes can tell us about things we might not even know are existing. We might not know there's not a law in West Virginia. We might not know about predatory lending. But when heroes speak up about what they're doing, even if it's hard for them and even if it's embarrassing, they fill us in on the things we need to know. And it's not just individuals, it can be companies as well. How many people here have heard of Juan Valdez? Sure, Juan Valdez, he's the guy from Colombia. He's a coffee grower. He's a farmer. Look how happy he is. Look at his apron, how clean it is. Look at the crease in his ironed shirt. Even his mule looks happy. Juan Valdez's family has been in the coffee growing business for generations. And he wants you to know that Colombia is the best place for you to get coffee. But in reality, Juan Valdez doesn't exist. He's really just a marketing logo. He was created in the 1950s by the Colombia coffee growers so they would convince you that it's okay to buy their coffee, even though the real growers look nothing like Juan Valdez. They're slaves. They're children. They're people who are working against their will in the fields to produce the Colombia coffee. We wouldn't know about that unless somebody told us. Coffee industry, if you are a coffee worker, the last place you want to work or live is Colombia. But at Starbucks, they understand this and they tell us about it. They tell us about the great things they're doing. You know, they go and they negotiate with the farmers directly. They inspect the farms. They inspect to see who's working. And they report on it. And they have auditors who not only audit their financial books, but audit the people who are growing their coffee. And because they tell us about it, we now know the scam behind Juan Valdez. And my favorite company in the whole wide world, Chipotle, where I would be right now if I wasn't talking to you, probably. They had a supplier who provides their pork who was violating their animal welfare standards. So they stopped selling pork in 1/3 of their restaurants for the better part of a year because they didn't want to sell that product. And they raised the awareness to us about how these pigs were being raised. Heroism, acts of heroism alter that moment. Talking about it can alter the future. And that's why we need heroes to tell us about what they're doing. We don't want to talk about ourselves because we're averse to bragging. We're taught that. Society has taught us over the years we're not supposed to boast. It's not polite. So how in the world do we go about convincing heroes to tell us what they're doing? Well, have you ever heard of humble bragging? Those of you on social media probably have heard of it. Humble bragging is this cool thing. So let's say you're so good looking that even with bad hair, people still are attracted to you. You could put on Facebook, hey, I just got out of bed, my hair's a mess, but the guys are still hitting on me at the mall. What's up with that, you know? Woe is me. That's called humble bragging, and if you can believe it, there's actually research into this that talks about whether it's effective or not and why we do it and how we do it. You know, maybe you're so smart because you have 2 college degrees and you can tell people it's such a burden to have so many degrees that people are constantly asking me for donations at multiple schools. Terrible. So humble bragging isn't the answer. But what if we kind of twisted it around a little bit? What if we changed humble bragging just a little bit? Concentrated on the humble, but changed what we're talking about, what we're bragging about. What if instead of bragging about ourselves, we talked about the problems than our solutions? And that's what Peter Samuelsson did. He didn't talk about himself. He talked about the people on the street. He talked about the people in the shelters and how they were afraid. So we want him talking about himself because he's educating us and he's making sure that we're not ignoring the homeless people who are living in our neighborhoods. Selena Roby, she didn't want everybody to know that she had been abused. She didn't want to talk about that. She didn't want to have to be in front of legislators talking about how her husband held her captive. But she wanted this law passed, and they convinced her, hey, if you're going to get this through public opinion, we're going to have to name it. Let's name it after you. So it was called Selena's Law. And Lisa Epstein, she didn't want everybody to know that she'd been duped by her bank. but she also wanted people in the country to know about predatory lending and what it was doing. So she was the one out front. She bragged about not what she did, but the things that she was changing. And at Chipotle, they realized that a lot of people don't care if their chicken was raised in a cage or if it was raised in a barnyard or if their corn has GMOs in it, but they know a lot of people do, and they want you to have the information so that you can make your own decisions. And that's why they talk about it. Quiet heroes will save the world, but they'll never change it. But if you talk about it, if you let people know what you're changing, you can influence the world. So let the hero from the French train dance with the stars. As long as he keeps reminding us that when you're faced with imminent death, you don't go down without a fight. So now, take this inspiration you've had for the day and that you'll get tomorrow and go. Go out and do great heroic things. But please, tell the world about it. And more importantly, tell the world why you did it. Thank you.